بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد المبعوث رحمة للعالمين وآله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد. So we were reading the last section of the chapter in the very beginning set of chapters that Imam al-Harawi refers to as al-bidayat, or beginnings, right? And we had said that the beginnings here denotes the beginning of being on a committed path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the path to God, or the path to Allah, is not one of physical distance, but it's one of overcoming one's own encumbrances, obstacles, and veils towards that goal. So it's something that's inherent within each person to overcome. And it's not something where it's a physical distance or a certain number of good deeds you have to do or anything like that. These are means, but the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, that was kind of distracting me, to be honest with you. But, my kids are grown up now, so I don't have to. But, so the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then is one that is not an easy one, but it's one that the spiritual doctors, our predecessors, have talked at length about, and Imam al-Harawi is one of those people. So they each have kind of a different kind of taxonomy, if you will, how they approach it. So he begins with what we call al-yaqadha, or awakening, which is the implicit assumption is that you're in a kind of a state of sleep or heedlessness before, and then you wake up. And he's addressing Muslims, he's not addressing non-Muslims. So even the Muslim himself can be in need of the awakening. So we're on the last section of that, and he said that there are three things that will help one in knowing and recognizing and acknowledging their folly or their sin. We had went over the first two already, ta'zeem al-haqq, wa ma'rifat al-nafs, wa tasdeeq al-wa'id. So knowing the haqq, knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and knowing the enormity of transgressing against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing yourself, which we talked about yesterday, man arafa nafsahu arafa rabbahu, and believing and imbibing the wa'id, or the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for those who He will deal with by His justice, even though He can choose to deal with us by His mercy. So then the last part, amma ma'rifat ziyadatu nuqsan fil ayyam, discerning the increase and decrease in your days. So knowing that the days that have already left, that you've left behind, will not return, but yet there are days ahead which you may still avail yourself of. So what are the three things that will help you towards that? So he said, فَإِنَّهَا تَسْتَقِيمُ بِثَلَاثَةِ أَشْيَاء. Right? It will become established by three things. بِسَمَاعِ الْعِلْمِ. Right? The first one he says is listening to knowledge. And some of them had different interpretations of what he meant by that exactly. So some said sama' al-ilm means that you actually need to have some knowledge, right? You need to have some knowledge of the deen to progress. And the way that there's certain different categorizations of knowledge, but one of those is what is fard ayn knowledge, what is obligatory on each individual. And there's kind of a set of that that's going to be common to everyone. And then depending upon your circumstance or situation, there will be things that you need to learn. And unfortunately for many Muslims, they wait till after the fact to ask about things. So before you get married, you should know about marriage. And in fact, you should know about divorce, right? Because once you are married, then you should know divorce is not something just to be thrown out as some type of threat or as a disciplinary tool, right? So if you know a little bit about marriage, then you know it's not supposed to be used for that. So how many are the people, the young men, who pronounce a threefold divorce, and according to the four schools, a threefold divorce even in one sitting is mu'abbad, which means that they are completely divorced and they may not remarry until the wife remarries someone else, consummates the marriage with that other person, and then either divorced or widowed, and then she can come back to the first. That's knowledge, that's ilm. People have to know that before they get married. People who enter into business, They have to know what are ahkam al-sharika, right? What are the rules of conducting business, right? If me and Abdurrahman would go into business, and that'd probably be a failure because of me, but not because of him. But let's just say, for argument's sake, we were to do that, and each one of us has a particular amount, right? Let's say he has 90,000 Canadian dollars, and I have 10,000 Canadian dollars. Then we have to know that he should get 90% of the profit, and I get 10% of the profit. Otherwise, if we were to have any other type of distribution, it would be not just unfair, but it would be against the Sharia, right? So you have to know those things. So those things that everyone has to know, right? If you're mukallaf, is you have to know the basics of how to pray, of how to fast, of how to pay the zakat if it's owed, if you're going to owe it. If you're going to Hajj, you need to know how to do all these things. So these things are before, not after. Right? You need to know them before. So sama' al-ilm is one interpretation, listening to knowledge. Or the sama' could be you being a person of inculcating knowledge, like sama' al-ashya, sama' al-kawn. In other words, listening with a perceptive ear. And it really means listening with a perceptive heart. So everything that you're taking in, you're taking it as a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? أَلَا فِي كُلِّ شَيْءٍ آيَةٌ تَدُلُّ عَنَّهُ الْوَاحِدُ, the popular line of Abu al-Atahiyah. Verily there's a sign in everything that points that He is the one. Right? And so you see all the signs, right? You're actually listening to it. You know, we said earlier in the other session that it's like there are nafahat, there are subtle spiritual breezes that are always there. You just have to be tuned into them. So part of being tuned into them is getting your tuner, your receiver set so that you can receive it. So they also said that this is a possible way of understanding sama' al-ilm. The second one, ijab al-dawa'i al-hurma, which I don't like this translation too much, so I'm going to dispense with it. Which is to be receptive to the protocol of sanctity, or things that are sanctified, right? Or sacrosanctity. And that's very important, right? Because many of the things we're reading about here, it's going to be against kind of the popular culture, where there's nothing that's sacred except the very idea that nothing is sacred, that's what's sacred. But for us, we have sacred things. And what does it mean, something to be sacred? It means it's unassailable. It means it's something that is beyond reproach. And these are anchors in our lives. They should serve as anchors, right? Allah, His prophets, the angels, the Quran, these are all unassailable, sacred symbols, right? Or symbols of sanctity that have to be observed. And if you don't have those things in your life, right? If there's no anchor, if there's nothing that is sacred to you, then everything becomes meaningless, right? If everything can be just as important as the next, as yesterday's thing, and then yesterday's thing then gets thrown out, and then you're worried about today's thing, and then that's the most important thing, then there's no grounding, right? We have thawabit. We have things that ground us, that are qat'iyat, that we know with absolute, or we should know with absolute certainty. So the dawa'i al-hurma, it's talking to you. It's inviting you to say, I am sacred, you must observe the sanctity of this thing, right? And everything that is haram, right, is in a way something that it's sanctified in that you should not approach it, right? That's why it's the same word, haram, hurma. Hurma means sanctity. Haram means that which is prohibited or you should stay away from. So, observing the sanctity of your own soul, of your own heart, by staying away from al-muharramat, staying away those things that Allah has told you to stay away from. So haram actually means that if you were to violate and go across that border, right, and transgress and go into what is haram, then you are violating, or you are leaving yourself susceptible to something of your own sanctity being violated, right? And it's not just an arbitrary list of do's and don'ts. Don't do this. It's not arbitrary. Everything in the deen, right, that we should stay away from, that in essence is sanctified from you approaching it, is for our own benefit. And then finally, he says the third aspect is suhbat al-salihin, right, which is keeping company with the righteous. Very important, extremely important, right? Because when you're by yourself, or when you're with bad company, you are going to see the world probably via distorted means, right? Definitely when you're with bad company. So when you are with good company, when you are with righteous people, right? And they said that it's not enough that their love, that their words are things that are righteous, or they talk a good talk. That's not enough. But their lahaz, right? Which means their very state, right? And Imam Ibn al-Sakandari says in the Hikam, لا تصحب من لا ينحدك الله حاله ولا يدلك على الله مقاله. Don't keep company with someone whose hal, whose state doesn't inspire you to God, or his speech doesn't lead you to God. In other words, don't take those people as your close confidants. We're not talking about acquaintances. We're not talking about colleagues at work. But we're talking about who are the people that you're going to grow in your deen with. Then this suhbah, right, is very important. Man jalasa jalis, right? Whoever sits company with someone, then there will be an exchange of, habits and of character traits and general mannerisms. This is unavoidable. It's inevitable. And this is, our teachers always emphasize, especially for young children, how important this actually is. That you have a responsibility to see to it that the suhbah of your children, and I would say specifically between the ages of 7 to 14, more so than the other ages, is vitally important to their upbringing. Because you can do all of the things you want to do in your house, and you can bring them to the hub, and you can have them observe Taraweeh, but if they have this suhbah that is not encouraging them and it's taking them in the other direction, it will be very, very difficult to overcome that. So, suhbat al-salihin, right? And it's beautiful because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't expect us, He doesn't leave us to our own devices and figure things out and say, just be a good Muslim. But He's giving us the tools, He's giving us the ways by which we can go about doing it. And He's setting the blueprint. All we have to do is kind of try to, honestly follow it. And then the last line in this chapter, he says, وَمَلَاكُ ذَلِكَ كُلِّ خَلْعُ الْعَادَاتِ. And attaining all of this will not be acquired except by giving up habits. الْعَادَات. In other words, you have to change. This is the most difficult part, right? He saved it for last, I think, because he didn't want to discourage people, because it's the most difficult thing that he's mentioned in the whole chapter so far. But it is perhaps the most important thing. Because if you can take all of this in, and then you say at the end of the day, well, I'm kind of doing that already, and I'm doing this, and I'm doing that, and I'm okay, then you didn't understand anything. Because you have to leave what you know. You have to leave your comfort zone, right? You have to leave that which is keeping you at a standstill, or it's keeping you in the proverbial hamster wheel. You're just spinning your wheels, you're not going anywhere. And you have to leave all of that. Right? And if you look at Sahaba Ridwanullah alayhim, they were transformed. They had to leave things. Why is the hijrah used as the pivotal date in the Islamic calendar? Because they left something. They left all that they know. Literally, they left only with the clothes on their backs, and everything else was left behind. And so we have this kind of watershed mark in the calendar before hijrah and after hijrah, right? Because those are the ones who went with the Prophet ﷺ to the hijrah, and it was for Allah and His Prophet and His Messenger. That's a whole different category. Like it was not, at that point, it was for keeps, because if you're willing to give up everything, right, for the deen, then this is a true test of your commitment. And many of us every day we could be tested in this way. Don't think you will not be tested. Many of our brothers and sisters in many parts of the world, literally, we know. They left their homes with literally the clothes on their backs, and they get into a boat on the Mediterranean. They don't know where it's going to go, whether it's going to sink, whether it's going to make it there, whether they have enough provision, and they set sail. We may be put in that situation. We never know. We may be put in a situation similar to that, or something like that. And, Allah, we ask Allah that He doesn't test us, our commitment in that way. Don't look for that. Don't anticipate that. Don't say, no, I'm ready for this. I want to prove my worth. No, you don't. Right? We only say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He give us the fortitude and the perseverance, if something like this were to happen to us, that we would make it through that. But we don't anticipate that. Right? Even the Prophet ﷺ, he said, don't anticipate liqa' al-adu. Don't anticipate or look forward to the meeting of the enemy, whatever that enemy may be. Right? We don't have an attitude of bring it on, I can handle it. That's not our attitude. right? We say, وَمَا تَوْفِيقِي إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ. That's what we say. We have no success except by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So changing your habits is very difficult, right? And that's why it's best to do it in a gradual manner. Ramadan, the whole month is about changing your habits, right? We're living a completely different schedule in Ramadan than outside of Ramadan. We're staying up later. We're praying Isha and Qiyam at 11 o'clock at night, maybe finishing by 12:30. Some of us don't go to sleep until after Fajr, right? Or we wake up before Fajr to have suhoor, right? We're getting together nightly, which probably we don't do all the time. So we have a completely different schedule. So it's a type of training period. And it's significant. 1 out of 12 months of the year, right? So that's what, 8.75% of your life? Nearly 9% of your life you're in Ramadan, right? Which is a big part of your life. So a big part of your life is singularly dedicated to transforming you. Ramadan is about transformation, but so are all the other acts of worship. So are the ibadat. The prayer should be transformative, right? If your prayer doesn't transform you, right? And the Prophet said it in different ways. من لا تنهى صلاته عن الفحشاء والمنكر فما ازداد إلا بعدا. Whoever's prayer does not make them of a quality so that they stop doing fahsha and munkar, yani evil speech and evil deeds, then they have not gotten closer, but they've moved further away. The prayer can actually be not a blessing, right, but a curse. It's possible, right? Because if it's only the physical aspect of it, it will grow to be burdensome, right? And the Quran talks about how the prayer is burdensome to some people. إِلَّا عَلَى الْخَاشِعِينَ. The ones who have khushu'ah, right, the ones who are living the inner aspects of the prayer is not burdensome, right? But for everybody else, it could be burdensome. And you can extrapolate that meaning to all the other acts of worship. That's why we said the other day, we invite to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't invite to the individual acts of worship per se, right? So maybe people misunderstood, we don't invite to Islam. Not that we don't invite to the deen, but the way we invite to the deen is by inviting to God, not by inviting to the individual acts of worship. Because if you invite someone to those individual acts of worship and they're not ready for that, you've just cast a burden on them, right? And Imam Abu Hassan al-Shadhili, he said it, من دلك على العمل فقد أتعبك ومن دلك على الله فقد نصحك. Whoever counsels you towards al-amal, individual acts of worship, أتعبك, they've tired you out, they've burdened you. ومن دلك على الله فقد نصحك. And the one who guides you or invites you to God, they have truly given you good counsel, right? So they're inviting you to khushu'ah. They're inviting you to reverence. They're inviting you to observance of the sanctity of all of the things in life, right? And it's via those things, then you will have the nahda, right? You will have the resurgence to want to do it, right? To want to pray, to want to do extra. But if you just singularly concentrate on the physical aspects of that, it will prove burdensome. And then invariably what happens is people feel guilty. And they say to themselves, how come I don't like the prayer? How come I don't like reading Quran? Maybe I'm evil. Maybe something's wrong with me. Maybe this deen is not for me. Maybe this. And they don't realize that, don't feel guilty about that, right? Don't feel guilty about it not penetrating you as of yet, right? Because maybe nothing wrong with you, but you have a little bit of homework to do. That's all. You have a little bit of groundwork to do. And that's focusing more on God, focusing more on Allah, focusing, as he said in the beginning, the blessings of God, right? Focusing on the ni'am and realization, right? The early part of the prophetic mission, before there was prayer, there was dhikr and fikr. There was contemplation, right? And there was remembrance of God. And, we need to work on that quite a bit. And it's one of the fastest paths to having a knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the salawat and the salah and the zakah and all these things, they're more like tahliyah, tahalli. They're more like helping you to embody virtue and focusing on specific divine names, focusing on the name of Allah, focusing on la ilaha illallah. These are means more for tahliyah, right, for removing vice. And so everyone's sort of daily repertoire litany should consist of something like that, of saying la ilaha illallah not less than 100 times in the day. saying astaghfirullah not less than 100 times in a day, giving salawat on the Prophet ﷺ not less than 100 times in a day. Right? That should be a goal for all of us. At the very minimum, we should be doing that. And we want to be amongst those people who are الذاكرين الله كثيرا والذاكرات, those from males and females who remember Allah much. So خلع العادات then to cast off bad habits, you need to focus. You're going to need help, and you need to do it gradually. Right? Don't just say, I'm going to transform overnight. You could. Many are the salihin, in an instant they transformed like that. That was tawfiq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in the language of the spiritual doctors, they would call such a person murad. And murad, right, is the one who is chosen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah chose to pull him out of whatever he is, and he brought him close. Versus al-murid, right, or disciple, is the one which is 99% of the people. The murad is rarity, but most people are going to be murid. Then they are going to be the ones on a committed path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when I say murid, I don't mean even specifically in what you may have heard about like a spiritual path or tariqah. That's even something different than what I'm talking about. I'm talking about in a general sense, the murid, the one who wants to be committed towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it means the one who has irada, the one who has an intent. You have to want it, right? And then you have to be committed. And to prove your commitment, you have to be willing to sacrifice. And that means giving up your bad habits, giving up your time wasters during the day, right? Giving up those things that are haram, giving up those things that may have shubha, right? They may have a lot of ambiguity about it, but it's better to leave it off because you cannot avoid all of the haram unless you kind of avoid something that's sitting next to the haram, which would be the ambiguous matters. And this ultimately is much more pivotal in one's early path than doing all of the nawafil, than doing so many good deeds, right? If you think like, oh, I have to do this 1,000 type of dhikr, and I have to do all of these extra prayers, and I have to do all of these extra sadaqat, and so forth, but you're not leaving off the haram, right? It's like someone who has a nice backyard garden and is planting seeds, but they didn't bother to remove the rubbish. And there's rubbish all over the place. And they're still planting the roses, and they're still planting the mangoes and the papaya, and we're at Sidi Nazim's house, so we had all that stuff. And all those things, yeah, but the garden's ugly. Even though you have those things, you're trying to sprout them, and they don't want to grow in rubbish, right? So you have to remove the rubbish. And staying away from haram is like removing the rubbish. Doing the halal and doing the fara'id and doing the nawafil, right, beyond that is extra. So if you have more spiritual inclination, if you have more inspiration, excitement to do the voluntary acts, I get really excited about Taraweeh and I can do it every Ramadan. But you know what, after Ramadan, when we have to do the 5 prayers, I have a hard time waking up for Fajr and it's just I'm not feeling it. That's problematic. If Taraweeh is going to keep you from praying Fajr, don't pray Taraweeh. Why? Because Fajr is fard. It's an obligation. So in the eyes of God, that's more important. For your own well-being and your own spiritual well-being and spiritual path, that's more important than praying Taraweeh. Taraweeh is voluntary. So you do not sacrifice that which is voluntary and less important for that which is more important. If you work a night job, or you work very early in the morning, right, and you have to be at work like 5 or 6 a.m., and if you came here to the hub and you saw it to the end till 12:30 or beyond, you know that you'll go to work tired and completely debilitated and you won't do the job that you need to do. What do you do in this situation? Don't pray Taraweeh. Pray a few rak'ahs, pray at home, and pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you, an opening that maybe you can find another job. You don't have to work so early. But right now there's an obligation, right? And fulfilling our commitments, right, especially when we make commitments to other human beings, that's an obligation, right? We don't, renege on that obligation. I used to work in the Muslim world, and sometimes I would see people, we'd get breaks for prayer and things like that, but only take the break that you need. These guys were like sitting in the musalla and they're hanging out and they're like, let's read these awrad and let's have a dars, and that's all nice, but don't we have a commitment to the employer? who's employing us and said that we're allowed to take breaks to pray, and then we should be back to the commitments that we're supposed to fulfill. And that may mean that you don't even pray the sunnah prayers, if that's the understanding that you have. If you have a different understanding, that's fine. But fulfilling your commitments is more important, right? Obligations, whether they be ritual obligations in the deen or commitments to others, which are in turn obligations in the deen as well, more important than doing the voluntary things. And the voluntary things are important as well. We didn't say they're not important, but we have to learn to prioritize. We have to learn to have a ladder of priorities and understand what comes first and what comes second and what comes third. And if your internal inclinations are not according to the priority ladder with Allah, then there's something wrong with your internal inclinations, not with the deen. And we'll stop here since it's time for Isha. And then tomorrow we will start Bab at-Tawbah, or repentance, inshaAllah. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Salamun ala al-mursaleen. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh Walead.